to see you all from this vantage point. So I'm going to start by reading part of a poem to you. So this was a poem I discovered by opening this book at random the other morning. It's a book of poems by Kay Ryan, an American poet. And it's called Why We Must Struggle. If we have not struggled as hard as we can at our strongest, how will we sense the shape of our losses, or know what sustains us longest, or name what change costs us? So if we have not struggled as hard as we can at our strongest, how will we sense the shape of our losses, or know what sustains us longest, or name what change costs us? So I thought that might be a good poem just to start with this talk, which is it's called The Wilderness Years, and it's about for Siddhartha Gautama. It really is, as you'll hear as I tell the story, it's about his struggle, his spiritual struggle. And well, I guess what the poem says to me is, well, the necessity of spiritual struggle. Sometimes we can think if we're struggling in our spiritual lives that we've kind of got it wrong, that means it's not something not proper's happening. But actually, I think hopefully what I'll be able to illustrate tonight is actually the struggle itself is all part of it. It's not all struggle, but there will be struggle actually in any serious endeavour in life. There will be struggle, because we, in any serious endeavour, will be coming up against the edge of ourselves. We'll be going further than we thought we could go in any serious, meaningful endeavour in life. So, yes, we had the talk last night from Priyavajra, and I think what stands out for me and what I keep trying to reflect on more and more deeply is that Buddhism starts with experience. In a way, that's what it is. Buddhism isn't something that somebody sort of thought up one day. It's not. It didn't just arise complete in somebody's mind as a sort of philosophy. It actually started with the actual experience of an actual person who, in the person of Siddhartha Gautama, who had experience and took that really seriously. He took his experience seriously. He took, first of all, his experience of what we call dukkha, that's the experience of suffering, that life contains suffering. When he saw those first three sights, he didn't just see them, he allowed them to impact on him. They sort of shocked him into an awakeness. And he took his experience of the fourth sight, the wandering mendicant who represented the possibility of a solution. He took that seriously. It resonated with him. He didn't just see that mendicant. It resonated with him. And that's what, well, more than moved him, that's what compelled him. Those sort of two aspects of realisation are what kept him going, in a way what pressurised him to act in this next phase of his quest. And, well, two things to draw out from that. One was that it wasn't just that he experienced that experience of suffering. He didn't just think, oh, I'm going to grow old, I'm going to get sick, I'm going to die. He realised that happens to every single person. So he said, often when we're suffering we think, oh, it's just me, isn't it? Like the world's got something against me, why did this happen to me? It's easy to narrow down like that, but he didn't do that. He saw, well, this affects everyone. And also he saw, similarly, sort of, well, if there is a potential for freedom from that, it must also apply to everyone. So already, even at this early stage, he's starting to see that. And he saw, as my trip Andrew drew it last night, he saw both these things together. He managed to have both, sort of have this insight into suffering and this inkling that there's a way beyond that, both at the same time, which is quite a hard thing to do. Often we identify with one or the other. Like when we're in suffering, we often can't see a way out. We think, well, this is just it. You know, we sort of overgeneralise from that experience. I think, well, this is just it. Life's going to be like this forevermore. And so we can identify with that pole, or sometimes, and especially sometimes, religion does this, our idea of religion does this, it sort of offers an answer sometime in the future. There'll be a way at almost kind of ignoring the suffering and sort of going to the other pole, which, well, the problem with that is it just doesn't ring true to us for very long. I remember when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my dad towards the end of his life, and he'd been a practicing Christian during his life, and then here he was coming to the end of his life, and things hadn't gone too well in some ways for him. And I remember him saying with some, I don't know if it's exactly bitterness, but some pain, he said, well, I tell you what, he said, if I was God, I'd have been a better God than God was. You know, so it doesn't ring true in the end, because you've got this promise of salvation and heaven, but actually there's the experience of suffering. So, you know, it's the promise over-identifies with that possibility of salvation. But whereas the Buddha, or the Buddha to be, from the very beginning, has the vision that contains both. That there is suffering in life and there's a possibility beyond that. And this compels him into action. So, and that's where we left off last night. So what happens? So I'm going to tell you a bit of what happens next. So he goes out of the palace. He's still dressed in all his princely clothes, but he swaps them with a beggar. So straight away he doesn't want to be recognised as a prince. So he's got this long flowing black hair. He chops off his hair, and he swaps his clothes with the first beggar he meets. So he's suddenly dressed in rags, and he suddenly, just looks like a beggar himself. And he starts begging for his food, which, as you can imagine, for a young prince, is a total shock to his system. You know, often, like, food's such a thing, isn't it? It's interesting, cooking on the retreat, you realise that food is quite important to people. We like the food we're used to, and if we don't get the food we're used to, it can be quite disconcerting, can't it? So it's just notice that, like, being the cook, we're trying our best to give everybody things that, you know, you'll be happy with, but also we know, well, probably for some of you, we're not giving you food you're used to. But imagine that for this young prince. He's very young, younger than any of us even, probably about 16 or 18, you know, and he just has this bowl, he's going round and begging for his own. People are just like pouring stuff in, all mixed up, you know, just all kind of leftovers and mixed up stuff. Holly's making a face at the thought of it. So he's begging for his food, but in a sense he doesn't mind, because he's on this quest, and he straight away looks for some people who can teach him. So he comes across 2 meditation teachers. That's what he's looking for, someone that he can look up to, someone that he can learn from. He's got an inkling that meditation is going to help in this quest that he's set out on. And he's a very good student of these teachers. He allows himself to be taught. He's completely receptive to their teachings. And he very quickly makes great advances, as it were, in meditation. And so much so that the first teacher says to him, look, actually, you've got to the same level as me. Like, you've learned everything I've got to teach you, you've got to the same level as me. Why don't we lead? Because there's a whole community of people meditating. Why don't we lead this community together? I'll offer you sort of co-leadership of this. Why don't we do that together? But the Buddha refuses that. And then the second teacher says, actually, you've surpassed me. You've gone even beyond what I can teach. Why don't you take over the book, not just co-lead it? Why don't you take over it? And again, the Buddha refuses that. He's been handed this, but he refuses it. So, well, why does he do that? He does it because he knows that even though he's learned everything these teachers have got to teach him, and even gone beyond them, he still hasn't, it's still limited. He still hasn't found the truth and the answers that he's looking for. So this shows quite a remarkable, quite a remarkable maturity, really, and quite a remarkable individuality. Because he's been offered quite a lot for a young man. Imagine, like, if you were an ambitious young person and you got offered the leadership of a whole group with a whole following, a kind of ready-made discipleship. For many people, it could be quite tempting to think, oh yeah, that's good, I'm brilliant at meditating, now I can teach all these people. And to be so looked up to, the people that are teaching him are now looking up to him. You can imagine it being quite seductive to a young princely person to take that on, but he just completely isn't drawn by that. We had this sort of physical going forth last night, but he's gone forth from having to have people have a good opinion of him, which is quite a thing when you think of it, isn't it? Because so much of our lives, we're often concerned with, what do people think of us? I mean, I feel that all the time, It's just even interesting in the cooking in the kitchen on a retreat like this. So what we had to do, we've had soup and dinner, so I made this, and I thought, well, that's quite nice, that's the soup, people are saying they like the soup, even a few people were coming up and saying that. I think, oh yeah, I think I'm quite good at this cooking, And then somebody else came and said, Subhadramati, the soup had a few lumps in it. And I was like, oh, did it? Or maybe I'm not so good at cooking. Why did I even do it? Why did I even volunteer for this cooking job? You notice, do people sort of resonate? You notice your mind is, just in such small, but and in bigger ways, and that's a small example, but sometimes we can be very, very affected by that. We can be very driven by a desire for approval, especially from approval from people we look up to. We can be driven by a wanting to please. We can be driven by, want to be accepted. We can be driven by wanting to have status. I'm sure that we recognise that. As a matter of fact, just in my own experience, we're just talking to people on retreat, I know that that is true for, probably all of us. And so here you've got Siddhartha Gautama that's not a concern of his. He's not driven by that. But the interesting thing is he doesn't go to the other extreme either. He's not a sort of rebel in the sense of being a rebel just for the sake of it. When he knows he has surpassed his teachers, and the teachers are acknowledging that. It's not like the sort of young rebel that's going, oh, they haven't got anything they can teach me, and kind of going off without trying it. He's really receptive to them. He tries everything that they've got to teach him, and it's they themselves that are saying, look, you've actually reached the stage that we're at. Yeah, because it's interesting, that kind of tendency to conform and want approval, and that tendency to rebel, they seem like the opposite poles, but they're actually just the flip side of the same coin, because in a way we've still got our eye on what other people think of us. We're not really free. Whichever, we'll probably naturally tend to one pole or the other, the sort of conformist type or the rebellious type, but neither of them is a really free position. So you've already got the young Siddhartha Gautama free from that. He really, all he wants is the truth. The vision is so strong with him that carries him forward. Yeah, he's not going to be seduced by conforming. He's not going to sort of just foolishly rebel before he's learned anything. So he very politely, very courteously takes his leave of those teachers. And so he's on his own. Yeah, he's on his own again. So what does he do now? So this is quite a famous bit of the story, what happens next. So he's already got a very strong instinct that nothing in the world of the senses, as it were, is of ultimate value. You remember the story from last night about the party that his father threw, you know, trying to tempt him to stay, and he realises, actually, this just isn't doing it for me anymore, it really, really isn't. So he's got this very strong instinct to sort of go out, well, into the wilderness, into the literal wilderness, into the forest, to try and take this quest deeper. He doesn't really quite know what he's going to do, but this is his instinct. And then he has three spontaneous images arise in his mind. They're all kind of connected. So he has an image of, he's imagining, well, what would you do if you were trying to light a fire? What would you do if you were trying to light a fire? And he thought, well, say you were trying to light a fire and the wood you were trying to light it with was all kind of green and sappy, and not only that, it was lying in some water. And then you come along, well, in the scriptures it said with a top fire stick. So I was imagining, well, even just imagine you come along with your box of matches. You're trying to light this fire, it's in this bit of wood, it's in water, it's all kind of wet wood anyway. You can just imagine you're striking every single match, it's never going to catch light. Yeah? You just end up really frustrated, it doesn't work. So that's his first image. The second image is also the piece of wood is now out of the water, but it's still a wet and sappy piece of new wood. Again, you'd strike every match and you wouldn't get anywhere. The fire just wouldn't ignite. But then thirdly, things will say you've got your wood, it's not only out of the water, but it's a completely cured and dry piece of wood. You know, the first match is going to light it then. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I was talking to Maitreya Bandra about these images earlier in the retreat. Just that notion of a fire is quite evocative in itself, because you're like something completely new coming into being. Yeah, you've got two pieces of wood and suddenly they become fire. So he knows something new has got to arise in his mind. And what he takes these three images to mean is he thinks, well, the wood, while it's still in the water and it's all wet, that's when you're still kind of in the world, yeah. When you're still in the world of craving, when you're still, what does he say? When you still have his desire, infatuation, urge, thirst, and fever for sensuality is not relinquished and stilled, then you're never going to be able to, no matter how much effort you make, it's not going to catch light. And so, but he's taken himself physically away from the world. So he's like, so then he thinks of the second bit of wood, but then he realises, well, even if you've physically taken yourself away from this world of the senses, but your mind is still full of craving and lust and infatuation and fever, you're still not going to be able to light the piece of wood. It's only if you've taken yourself away to a quiet, secluded spot and you manage to quiet your mind, then you'll be able to light the fire. So that's the images that he has. So then he thinks, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to do. And this is what he does. This is what he thinks to himself. He thinks, right, how am I going to get my mind quiet? He says, right, suppose that so this is me reading from the scriptures. He says, okay, I'm going to clench my teeth. I'm going to press my tongue against the roof of my mouth. And I'm going to take my mind and I'm going to beat it down and constrain it and crush it with my awareness. That's what he's going to do, and that's what he sets out to do. And he says it's going to be just like a strong man seizing a weaker man by the head and throat and beating him down, constraining him and crushing him. That's what we're doing. And this is what the Siddhartha Gautama sets out to do, tirelessly, so he really, really goes for it. And, to some extent, it sort of works, to some extent. He says that he does, what he ends up with is a tireless persistence, an unmuddled mindfulness, but his body isn't calm because he's doing this, well, he's fighting with himself, isn't it? It's very clear, the imagery is very, very explicitly violent. He's fighting with his own mind, he's trying to force his own mind. So this is obviously quite extreme, what he's doing, but sometimes that's what we kind of resort to. It's interesting, I teach meditation, I've met quite a few who teach meditation at the London Buddhist Centre, and often when people come along to meditate, I ask them, well, why have they come along? And people, they often say, oh, my mind, I've just got to get control of my mind, I've just got to get rid of all these thoughts in my mind, I want to be calm. And you get the sense that of this kind of fight with their own minds, yeah? So we can sometimes feel that our mind is our enemy that's got to be crushed and beaten down. It's almost like we've become polarised with our own minds, are even afraid of our own minds. I read a line in a poem once, and it talked about when we're in that state, it's like life trying to cure itself of itself. We think we've got to cure ourselves of our own life. We're in conflict with ourselves. And sometimes we even manage to some extent do this for at least a short-lived time. I remember years ago knowing someone that when I was quite young. I remember I was an early boyfriend of mine. His grandfather died. We were both quite young, about 18. His grandfather died, and he was terribly upset. He'd been very close to his grandfather, and he was very, very upset. And then a few weeks later he came to me and he announced, right, I know what to do, I've got the answer to this, I'm just not going to love anyone again. Yeah, so that's kind of the same attitude as Siddhartha had. So you kind of think, well, loving someone's caused me pain, okay, I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of crush that part of myself out, and then I won't feel the pain anymore. So I think we can, sometimes it's like we can be afraid of our own minds and our own hearts, and think we've got to kind of crush them and sort of fight with them and control them. So, and this is what Siddhartha Gautama is trying to do here. You can sort of see what led him to this, yeah? He's sort of saying, well, this is what I've got to do. And he keeps going with this, so he's doing the crushing of his mind, then he thinks, okay, I know what I'll do next. He says, I'll practice the trance of non-breathing. So he does this, and it's pretty. It's not got very pleasant physical consequences for him. Although he does get some control over his mind by doing it. And then famously, which you might have heard of, he decides to practice going almost without food. So he just takes a tiny, tiny bit of food at a time. Just in some accounts it says a grain of rice a day. So in any case, very, very little food. And he, again, he's got this idea, well, if he can totally kind of, if he can sort of crush out any craving, even for food, then somehow there'll be some spirit in him that will become free. Yeah? So this is his whole idea. So he does this for quite a long time. He becomes quite famous for these practices and gathers quite a following around him. And then I think quite remarkable thing happens at this point when you're reading the account in the scripture. He sort of thinks to himself, he's been doing this for a while, he's really, really skeletal. We've got these sort of branches on the shrine, white branches representing the sort of skeletal state he's got into. And he thinks to himself, he says, gosh, every day in the past that's like practiced this kind of austerity, it would have been quite common at the time in India to practice these austerities for spiritual reasons. He thinks, every day in the past that's practiced this, nobody's gone further than me. Every day in the future that's ever going to practice it, nobody will ever go further than me. Every day that's practicing it at the moment, nobody's going further than me. Actually, it's not got me anywhere. Yeah, so then he realises, I haven't attained any superior state. I haven't got any knowledge or vision. And then he says, just quite simply, could there be another way to awakening? Could there be another way? So I just think that's interesting. I'll tell you why I think that's interesting. So the first thing I think that's interesting is that he is able to intelligently critique his experience. That he does actually stop and think, yeah? Because if we don't do that, then we will get lost. If we don't actually apply our intelligence to whatever we're doing, whether it's meditation or whatever practice we're doing to try and grow and develop, then we'll get lost. It's very easy to slip into seeing practices, such as meditation and so on, as ends in themselves, especially if we've been doing it for a little while. Those of you that are new to it are in the fortunate position of having a new and freshness to it. Those of us that have been doing it for a bit more of a while, it can slip into, you almost forget why you're doing it. It just becomes a bit of a routine. And what's needed is to ask oneself from time to time, is this working? And ask our friends. I mean, we're in the lucky position of we've got other people we can also ask. The Buddha was on his own. We can ask our friends, have you noticed any difference in me? Does this seem to be working for me? So we have to have an ability to apply our intelligence to whatever we're doing. And to see that any practices, any spiritual practice, is a doorway to something beyond itself. It's always got to be a doorway. It can never be an end in itself. And a door in itself is an interesting little image, isn't it? Because a door can open onto something, but it can also shut something out. If we are intelligent with our practice is a doorway onto something. If we fail to be intelligent, then actually the very thing that we think we're doing in our spiritual practice ends up shutting us out. It shuts us out from the truth if we take it as an end in itself. if you sort of latch on to practices in Zen themselves, it's like the door just becomes part of the wall. And well, take that to an extreme, and it can get, well, even fanatical, can't it? And I think that tendency to literalise it's quite hardwired in us as human beings. We often want certainty, so we have to actively practice having an intelligent critique of whatever we're doing. And Buddhism particularly recognises this. Buddhism explicitly asks us to test our experience, to test it within our own experience and with the opinion of those people we look up to, our friends and teachers and so on. Of course, the opposite extreme to that is doubt. The opposite extreme is when we don't even give something a chance. We start doubting it before we've even given it a go. So you can see that Siddhartha doesn't fall into either of those traps. He gives it a really good go, but then when he sees it isn't working, he's got the guts to stop, yeah? Because it does take some courage to actually square up to yourself and think, oh, actually, this isn't working anymore. So again, I think it's quite remarkable that as soon as he sees it's not working, he doesn't kind of waste time. He doesn't waste time kind of getting into sort of lamentation and giving himself a hard time. He doesn't go, oh no, I've wasted 5 years of my life. He doesn't sort of blame himself. He doesn't blame other people. He doesn't go, oh, it was you lot, you made me do it. He doesn't, and he doesn't sort of deny. That's the other thing we can do. We can be, when we've invested loads of time and energy into something, sometimes we can just keep going, almost like we think, oh my God, I can't stop now. I remember once years ago, a friend of mine told me she got into a relationship with someone against the advice of all her friends, and then she said, and then the thing was, even when it wasn't working, I had to keep going because I didn't want to sort of prove them right. We can get a bit pig-headed, can't we? So Siddhartha doesn't do anything like that. He just says, this hasn't worked. Could there be another path? Yeah. So I think that shows extreme individuality and maturity. So then what happens then is he has a spontaneous vision. He remembers an incident from his childhood. And what he remembers is a time when he was sitting under a rose apple tree. And what it was he was a young boy. If you remember, his father was this nobleman, and they used to have, every year they used to have a sort of ritual ploughing of the fields, and it was a sort of big festival type of thing. And anyway, the young Siddhartha took himself away, so he just, wanted to be a bit quiet. He took himself away, and he just sat under this rose apple tree. And while he was sitting there, he spontaneously found himself in a very natural, positive, fluid, responsive state of mind. So where he was quite contented and just natural happiness was bubbling up. But it wasn't the sort of intoxicated sort of happiness like being at a party or something. It was very, very responsive. So in some accounts it said that as this ploughing match was going on, little creatures were getting unearthed and some were even getting chopped up by the plough. His heart was able to go out to them, so he was connecting with life. So it was this real sort of, as I say, responsiveness, which I think characterises a true positive state. It wasn't rigid. It was able to move, able to sort of respond to whatever came to him. So, he remembered this, and he thought, oh, maybe this is it actually. Maybe this is a clue to the sort of deeper states that I'm trying to get into. Maybe this is a clue to the path that I'm trying to look for. I think of this the young Siddhartha sitting under the tree as a really very, very human, a sort of truly human state of being. It's the opposite of trying to cure life of itself. It's embracing life, embracing his own life and responsive to the life around. It's the opposite of being afraid of oneself. And it was very pleasurable. So, because you remember before when he'd left the palace, it was like he was kind of a bit, well, he was not just a bit, he was totally disgusted by all this kind of hedonistic pleasure seeking, and he went to the other extreme. He thought, well, I'll just shut pleasure out of my life, I'll just sort of mortify myself. And then he thought, oh, but actually that rose apple tree experience, there was pleasure there, but it seemed to be a different kind of pleasure. It wasn't the pleasure born out of craving. It was just that natural, it was just something very simple and natural about it. And he realised, I don't have to be afraid of that. I don't have to be afraid of that. I don't need to fight with myself anymore. I can allow that wholesome, natural pleasure some space. I can allow it to deepen. And he had this intuition of that this was what was going to take him deeper. So this is what he thought to himself, and he realised, so there he still hadn't had any proper food for ages, and he realised, actually, if I'm going to connect with this state that I remember from being a child, and if I'm going to try and deepen this, I'm going to have to take some solid food. I can't do it in this state, so he took this practical step of, he took some solid food, and all the people that had been thinking he was really wonderful and famous were really appalled when they saw this happen. And in particular, these five people that had become his closest disciples, they were horrified at him taking this solid food. They thought he'd gone soft, and they said, oh, Gautama is now living luxuriously. He's abandoned his exertion. He's backsliding into abundance. And they all left him. So once again, he was alone. He was alone, sustained by his vision that he'd had back in the palace, and sustained now by this new realisation, very strong intuition that he'd had, that actually he'd been in the extreme of the luxurious of the palace. That hadn't worked, that hadn't given him any spiritual answers. It wasn't even a truly human state. He'd lived this life of asceticism. That hadn't worked. But yet here he'd found something that seemed to be something quite different from either of them. Quite different from either of them. And he had this very strong sense of this is the next step that he had to take. He had to reconnect with the rose apple tree experience. So that's where I'm going to leave you tonight. Invite you to perhaps think of if you've had any rose apple tree type experiences yourself. If you have, perhaps as a child or perhaps as an adult, maybe just connect with what were the qualities of that for you. And tomorrow night we'll hear what happened to Siddhartha Gautama next. So, thank you.
What do, and I know this is true, isn't it? What we tend to do is to go one way or the other. I know from what people have been saying in our group and my own experience, we're trying to force ourselves, just even here in this shrine room, sitting in our meditation cushions, thinking, I'm going to do it. Get up. So we've got this crushing kind of controlling oppression going on inside ourselves. It looks like some of you recognise that. Or on the other side, we think, oh, for goodness sake, just going to go have a cup of tea and 3 more biscuits. 2 puddings. But what we've got now is this, as it were, sort of a hazy promise of something totally different, which has got a flavour of life enhancement about it. Something open, something natural, something free. Something that has the taste of pleasure, but a completely different kind of pleasure. A sort of wholesome, grounded pleasure. It reminds me of you talking about, in my group, about having seen the chickens. It's something from the natural environment. And something that's kind of innocent also. But it's innocence that's marked by this quality of intelligent critical awareness that Subhadramati was telling us about. I just think it's fantastic that Subhadramati was talking about this part of the Buddha's story, because in a way, when I think of her, she is perhaps, she's a very good exemplar for me of someone who has that sort of wholesome integration about her. I was saying this to her the other night because we were sharing a room here, that she's kind of through and through Subhadramati. It's not that she's kind of, doing all this control, or that she's kind of tipping over into excess. And the cooks are all smiling at me. It looks like they know what I mean. So I'd just like us all to say thank you once again to Subhadramati for a lovely invocation of this time of crisis, really, in Buddha's life. So, what we're going to do now is we're going to sort out the room for the puja. And those of you who were here last night will know we need to have a good, nice curve of space here. So if you wouldn't mind at the back, moving back. If there are lots of cushions without owners in the way, please pick them up.